Welcome back to Deck Check MTG. I'm Ganesh, and I'll be teaching you how to mulligan like a pro with Blue Farm. The mulligan phase is one of the most difficult decisions in cEDH, and a lot of players really struggle with it. So we'll go in depth into the basics of mulling, how deep to mull, and what to look for in different pod compositions with examples. So yes, the mulligan can be very intimidating, especially since you're losing a card every time. But don't worry, I'm confident if you watch this video completely, your skills will improve. So why listen to what I have to say? I will just let my results speak for themselves, and I strongly encourage you to consider tournament record before taking advice from anyone. So with that said, let's take a look at the building blocks for our keepable hands. And a very quick explanation on how the mull works in Commander. You draw 7 cards, and then if you don't like those, you'll shuffle and draw another 7. For each time after you mull, after the first 2, you'll have to bottom 1 additional card. Your third mull will keep you 6 cards, your fourth will be 5, and so on. So the categories below are what we are generally looking for. So if we draw a hand with very few or too many of the things listed below, it is probably a mulligan. For example, a hand with 6 lands is usually a mulligan, as is a hand with no lands. Most good hands will include at least 1 or 2 lands. There are of course exceptions to this rule. Sometimes you can draw a lot of fast mana rocks or rituals and try to get your mana that way. However, most of the time we will need at least a few to get started with the game. Fetches and pain lands are the best because they can get us the exact colors we need, and our fetches will fuel breach later on in the game. So next we have mana rocks and fast mana. These will enable us to quickly push out our value engines or ad nauseam. Don't put too much consideration into the 2 mana rocks like Arcane Signet and the Talismans, because if that's all we have for ramp, they will take up our entire turn 2 and leave us with 1 mana on turn 2, which we might not be able to do anything with. We can use rituals as well, but they can be worse overall than mana rocks since we only get to use them once. However, if we can use them to turbo out an Ad Naus or another value engine, they are great. This is probably the most important part of mulliganing with Blue Farm, our draw engines. We want to prioritize Mystic Remora, Esper Sentinel, and Rhystic Study if possible. Of course, this won't always happen, so ramping out a quick Tymna or Crom is also a very decent game plan. Interaction and stack pieces are always a good thing to have, but how badly you need them really depends on the other decks at the table. We'll go more in depth in a bit. Lastly, sometimes you can draw good ad nauseam starts, for example with multiple rituals and natural ad naus, in which case you can try for an early win depending on who else is in the pod. So here we have some examples of starting hands. I just went to Moxfield and I hit the draw random hand a few times. Feel free to pause the video and take a look at each of these 4 hands with 7 cards. So try to make your own decision on which hands to keep and which to mull. Keep in mind what I showed you earlier. So go ahead and pause now. Alright, so let's take a look at the first hand. At first glance, you might think this is a keep because we have a Rhystic Study and we do have 2 lands. However, I would 100% say this is a mulligan. Even though we have a Rhystic, we have no way of getting it out quickly. Our turn 1 is going to be land pass. Turn 2 is also land pass, so we could maybe Tainted Pact for something, but that's not very good. And we have to hope to draw a 3rd land or mana source on turn 3, by which point Rhystic might just get countered or other players may have already run away with the game. So this next hand at first glance looks like a keep. It's got our fast mana here with Soul Ring, it's got 2 lands, it's got a few decent creatures here, but I would say this hand is a trap hand, because our turn 1 will be Spire into Soul Ring, so it'll tap for any mana, which is good, but then our turn 2 is going to be kind of bad. So we will be able to maybe flash out Fairy Mastermind and hold up Red Blast, because we can use the Soul Ring and the Otawara for Mastermind, and this will tap for red. However, what we really would like to get out here is actually Lotho or Tymna. And this hand is just not super conducive. We can't actually cast Lotho or Tymna or Crom with the way this hand is very quickly. Now I will say as a caveat, this hand is actually very good against Turbo, so this is a consideration if you're going against maybe a Rogsai or something to keep this, because you will maybe top deck a land or something else that will let you play Tymna eventually, and having Red Blast and Mindbreak Trap up against them is pretty good. So if you're not against Turbo, I would probably mull this hand, but if you are against Turbo, it's worth considering keeping, especially if this is your 5 or 6. So this next hand, I would also say, is a keep. You have many different options here, actually. So you can go for the land, Rite of Flame, gamble for Mana Crypt, hope it hits one of these 2 lands here, then play your Talisman, and then get out Tymna. It's a bit of a riskier line. The safer way to do it is to play your land, Rite of Flame, into Talisman, into your Jewel Lotus, and then use these 2 to cast Tymna. And then you'll also have Gamble up. You could also try to risk it and go land, gamble for Crypt, land, Rite of Flame, gamble for Crypt, and then use the Crypt, the 1 floating from Rite of Flame, and the Jewel Lotus to get out a turn 1 Crom. And which one you're going to pick out of these options really just depends on the pod composition. So if you're against a lot of decks that you think are going to cast 2 spells a turn, it's Crom. But if it's a bit of a slower game, then it's probably going to be Tymna. And whether or not you actually use the gamble, it's probably a no, especially if you're just casting Tymna. Most games I would go Rite of Flame, Talisman, Jewel Lotus here, and just get out Tymna and save the gamble for something else. This next hand here at the bottom is also a very good keep. The one problem with this is that it does not have a way to get out Mystic Remora turn 1. However, if you are not going first, you will almost certainly have Dockside up. So what you can do is play your Ancient Tomb, play your Crypt, play your Talisman, play your Dockside, and let's say he makes you 2 treasures. Well, now you have Mystic Remora with the Swan Song backup. So this is a very, very strong hand. I would keep this almost 100% of the time in almost any pot. So very good. So next up, let's talk about a very, very difficult subject. How deep do we actually mulligan with Blue Farm? So the best advice is don't look for a playable hand, look for a good hand. So on the previous slide, we saw this is a playable hand. We can keep this one with the Fairy Mastermind and the Soul Ring. But is it a good hand? Not really. It doesn't really do much. We don't really get any draw engines down. Nothing like that. Definitely don't be afraid to mull low. We can win even by going down to 4 cards. I've done it multiple times. It sucks, but if we're able to get a good start, it's much, much more important to do that than have a bad 7. My average amount of cards kept is 6. So sometimes that's 5, sometimes that's 6 or 7, but that's about how many cards I keep on average. It's very important also to tailor your hand to your pod. So if you're playing against, like let's say a creature heavy stacks deck, your Remora's, Sentinel's, Heuristics are not going to be as good. For one, just because they're not casting as many non-creature spells, and 2, if they're slowing down the game, a lot of the time people will just pay the 1 for your Heuristic. So you won't actually end up drawing any cards, and eventually people will just beat you to death. So it might be a good idea to look at a early commander instead. Also, you can mulligan if you find a hand with a very early stacks piece. It can be backbreaking for other decks. So for example, if you have just a decent hand but it has a Containment Priest and you're going against Winota, that can be very, very impactful. Another example is keeping a turn 1 Draenith versus a Kinnan. So if you're able to get that out under them, it is very difficult for them to progress their game state. Another very important thing to consider, seat order. So this is a general guide for what your game plan is in each seat. This will vary with pod composition also, but I would say this is generally how I play a lot of the time. So if you're first, you should mulligan very aggressively. You're going to look for either a really good start with the draw engine, or you're going to look for a fast Ad Naus depending on your pod. If you're going second, you should also mulligan decently aggressively for stuff, but you need to keep interaction in mind, because while player 1 might not just go and win turn 1, it's very possible they will do it turn 2. So you kind of need to deploy your lands and have some mana up for their second turn sometimes. Player 3 is kind of in a rough spot. You do need to consider interaction and stacks a bit more heavily, because you have the player 1 problem, but you also have it for player 2. So it's pretty rough. And for player 4, you should just aggressively mulligan. You're probably not winning anyway, and I will show the statistics in a second, but it's really rough being in 4th seat. Just try to get the best possible hand you can, and don't worry, I would say, about interaction. So let's take a look at the win rates for all of those. So this was from Punt City, so we can see in that tournament, the first player had like almost a 40% win rate, 39%. Seat 2 and Seat 3 had about 21% each. And then Seat 4 had the absolute lowest win rate at 18%, which is just sad. And there is the source at the bottom there. So let's talk about some pod competitions and what to look for in each pod. So I won't be able to go over every single different type of pod, but this is a good general guide. So in the heavy blue pods, we are not going to look for an early combo or an early ad nauseum because it's probably not going to work. People are going to have counter spells. So instead, what we're going to do is focus on our draw engines. We're going to look for our Aristics, our Mystics, our Crom, our Tymna. So yeah, if we can get down a turn 1 Mystic or Esper, that's great. Turn 2 Ristic is also very realistic because we can go turn 1 Rock, and then turn 2 we can play a land, and then that's 3 mana right there. We can also look for, early Tymna Crom. It's nice to have some interaction. This is less to stop people from winning in heavy blue pods and more just kind of stop their value pieces. Maybe try to kill a Kinnan or something. And then also stacks pieces are going to be very powerful because they generally won't get countered in heavy blue pods. Usually they might get removed later on in the game, but sometimes other players will counter to protect, say if they have their commander out, they might counter to protect your Draenith, for example. Yeah, like Draenith, Bowmaster is also very, very impactful stacks piece. So what do you do when you go into non-blue pods? You can heavily mulligan for an early combo like Breach or Naus. It depends on your pod composition. If you're going against turbo decks, you have to keep interaction. Or you can try to go for like a Ristic or a Mystic, but you really have to be careful because if that gets mental misstepped or something, you're just going to lose the game. So I'd highly recommend keeping some form of interaction for them. Against stacks decks, like creature heavy stuff, you have to be very, very careful about mulling with rocks like Mana Crypt and stuff, because if they're a oof deck, that can just make you lose the game. So there's not really a whole lot of counterplay to it besides just killing it. So consider maybe a little bit of removal if you can. And there's going to be a lot less focus on Remora, Esper, and Ristic in stacks games, because the game's going to slow down a lot, and again, people will a lot of time just have the opportunity to just pay for stuff. This can have kind of a caveat if there's another turbo deck at the table and they just don't care about your stick and they just go for it. Sometimes there you can draw a lot of cards, but a lot of times what will happen is the game will just slow down, people will pay the 1 every time, and then you'll just die to combat damage. So be careful about that. So instead of those, sometimes we can try to look for like an early Tymna and Crom, because these are going to guarantee us the card draw, whereas with Esper and Ristic, a lot of times people just pay the 1. Against stacks decks, definitely consider your board wipes and removal. It's going to be very impactful. So one other thing I would like to share with you is there's this very helpful website called the cEDH Pod Randomizer. I will link it in the description. So take a look. You can actually select blue farm up here, lock it, and then you can randomize the other things in the pod, and you can also randomize the starting hand down here. So it's actually a very helpful tool and is much more useful than just goldfishing a random card without any context. Yeah, so that'll do it for this video. Thanks very much for watching. If you made it this far, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you later.